This weekend, I have struggled to get this image out of my head. This is a tweet posted by J.K. Rowling on the 17th. Time flies so quickly. It's last Thursday. Following the announcement that the UK Supreme Court had decided that for the purposes of equality law here in the UK, trans women do not count as women. For the purposes of equality law, your birth sex counts as your sex for those purposes, right? So for example, within the context of UK equalities law now, you cannot, and again, this is me sort of saying what the law says, you cannot be the subject of misogyny if you are a trans woman. You can equally not be discriminated against as a man if you are a trans man. The particular thing, or the particular kind of focus which has been drawn out of this, because it is kind of one of the ways in which this can be twisted into kind of a sort of hot topic, is that spaces which are kind of defined as women-only spaces or men's-only spaces, although kind of in practice there are fewer of those, the decision on who can be allowed into those spaces is based upon the sex that you had at birth. What I want to do is talk a little bit about the kind of energy behind the politics here, the kind of cultural contours of it, rather than digging too much into the legal interpretation. That is kind of not my area, but I just want to kind of sketch out some of the kind of backstory, I guess, for want of a kind of better phrasing. Effectively, the Scottish government had introduced new guidelines around various panels, which said that there had to be a certain amount of representation of women on these panels. And the way they laid it out was that trans women could be included in the numbers for how many women were on said panel. A group called For Women Scotland, which is let's give them the kind of benefit of how they describe themselves. We're a group of women from all over Scotland working to protect and strengthen women and children's rights, in effect, particularly around issues surrounding trans people, specifically trans women. They effectively took the Scottish government to court to say, actually, we want to make sure that those spots on panels are that you can only count cis women as women within that. Now, this is one of those where you get these cases that go up to Supreme Court level, whatever kind of country you're in, where they kind of get escalated to one of the highest court in the land. What happens is there is kind of a specific circumstance, a specific case, a specific situation that is being discussed. But the reason it becomes important is because the way in which our legal system works here in the UK, also kind of how it works in the US, how it works in a lot of countries where we have a kind of system of case law, is that the law works on precedent, right? So if the Supreme Court decide to rule in a certain way that the definition of women for the purposes of equality law means one thing in this specific case, that it will become the case that will be true in other scenarios as well, right? So although this specifically is about panels in Scotland, actually it is something that kind of retroactively becomes true of any instance in which there is a single gender, single sex space. Odyssey 108 says, do you have any laws preventing discrimination on the basis of sexuality? So all of this kind of comes back to the Equality Act in the UK, which basically brought together a bunch of kind of quite specific laws around, you can sort of see here on the page, sex discrimination, race discrimination, disability discrimination, and kind of tried to weave it together as a kind of single act, a single bill. And it also includes age, you can see, And effectively, the Equalities Act kind of lays out various different categories by which you cannot discriminate between people in most circumstances. However, what it does allow is for kind of certain scenarios in which the idea of discriminating against people in terms of age, in terms of sex, in terms of physical ability, it kind of lays out that there are certain circumstances in which it's kind of okay to do that because we've decided that it would be worse if you couldn't, right? And there's a kind of like legitimate end that you are trying to reach. So one such example is that a public building or a business which has gendered toilets is allowed to discriminate on who can go into which room, because it is deemed that there are social benefits and kind of safety benefits to that being an area where you do discriminate, which kind of outweigh the kind of discrimination. Other aspects are, if you have a refuge of some description, where people might have been facing domestic violence, whereby having a space where men are not allowed, if it's a women's refuge, because it would cause significant distress, because you want to avoid re-traumatizing people, all this kind of stuff. The phrase is where you have a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim, right? So you have a legitimate reason that you're doing it. You've not kind of made up this is actually just our straights only bar, and we've just decided it's that for no reason, but also the thing you're doing is proportionate to that goal. And so now, for the purposes of this act, the Supreme Court ruling says that when all of that stuff is happening on the basis of sex, and particularly those kind of moments where you are discriminating in a way to and particularly in those moments where you are discriminating because you kind of have a legitimate aim and you've done so proportionately, the ruling is that the way in which you can and should and have to do that is based on one's sex at birth rather than one's current sex and gender. And the other thing it's worth saying before we kind of move on to some of the other aspects of this is that because this is a Supreme Court ruling, it is an interpretation of already existing laws. I think it's potentially easy to misread this as that the law has changed. In practice, what has happened, or in theory what has happened, maybe that is what's happened in practice, but in theory what has happened is that the court has established that the interpretation of the existing law should be this way, right? And that, therefore, in effect, this has always been the law. And if people have interpreted it differently in the past, they've been interpreting it wrong. Which I think there is a real danger in that, by the way. I was looking at the front page of the Daily Mail today, which is led with Starmer must break his silence on trans judgment. My worry is that this is going to present a bit of a get out of jail free card to a lot of politicians, particularly those who are swimming with the tide in terms of the rise of transphobia in the UK, and yet who also would still like to present themselves as allies. Particularly, I'm thinking here, frontbench members of the Labour Party, who really want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to be seen as allies, in some regards, of the LGBTQ plus community. At the same time, they are, on this topic, on migration, on plenty of other aspects, are very much just going with the flow in terms of right-wing populism. My kind of worry about one thing that might happen here is that this ruling gives a bit of a get-out-of-jail-free card, wherein they will now be able to sort of defer to the court and say, well, the Supreme Court has said that the way in which equalities law works in the UK is that discrimination happens on the basis of birth sex in a way which disregards the fact that they have the ability to change the law and make that not so. Because it is entirely within the capabilities of certainly the Labour Party with a humongous majority to go, oh, actually, we do think that trans women, trans men should have legal protections based on their gender, and to pass laws to make that possible. My feeling is that they might use this as a bit of a get-out-of-jail-free card and be like, oh no, we are simply at the whims of the courts, Serial Chick saying, I really don't think they do. They've been falling over themselves to be the biggest Nazis possible when it comes to trans people. Yes, this is not me kind of like excusing the policies and kind of trajectory of the front bench of the Labour Party. However, I do think they feel awkward about it, and they're aware that there are political problems for them, if not in the immediate future, certainly further down the line, if they continue down this track. Transphobia, kind of hardcore anti-migration rhetoric, these things are very popular amongst one part of the populace, but it kind of forces them to tie themselves to a certain mast. And in particular, when we look at some of the topics which the activists who have really pushed for this ruling are keen to move on to next, some of those, it becomes even trickier for anyone who's kind of like associated with the Labour Party to follow down. Again, not necessarily because they have any grand moral drive that they would be betraying, but because I think there's the potential that any votership support kind of slips through the cracks. I mean, Esri42 here, so they just got here, did the protests, get much news coverage. That maybe brings us on to the kind of next bit, because there has been two, understandably, responses to this ruling. One has been that over the weekend there were large demonstrations across the country, particularly large one in London, but also in cities elsewhere in the country. Kind of rallies of support by trans people, by allies, kind of voicing some kind of sense of either solidarity or sympathy, I guess, following this ruling. One of the complicated things being that this is one of those topics that's really kind of tough to get into the why it's happening aspect of it. I think when a government makes a decision, or when a law is passed, it's kind of really obvious to see who is doing the thing and why is it happening. When a ruling is made through the courts like this, it is just a lot more difficult to understand, right? There's a discussion in the chat a moment ago about, how is the Supreme Court chosen? Like, a lot of this is kind of bureaucratic baggage, right? And it is useful at times, and yet it's one of the aspects of our political system that's actually quite hard to engage with. One of the things that was just coming up in this article was that, where's like the initial bit where it kind of lays it out? So there was it's one of the first kind of announcements to come out about how this law was going to change things, was that the British Transport Police, which is a kind of specialised police service which exists mostly for the train network here in the UK. They also kind of fulfil some other functions, but the times you are most likely to see them are on train platforms or on the on trains themselves. They often do a lot of kind of shepherding football fans to away games as well. But one of the first kind of announcements was that the British Transport Police were going to begin the practice of trans women would get searched by men. And there's, understandably been a huge amount of worry and outrage surrounding that, right? And one of the things that's been drawn out is that actually the practicalities of all this are really complicated. There's a thing in the UK called a gender recognition certificate, which if you are transitioning is a sort of piece of paper that you can get, which says, that the legal system of this country has decided that I am legitimately transitioning. These are not, it's worth saying, easy things to get. They require a whole kind of medicalized pathway to getting that document. Mix Moo says congrats on the trans. But the suggesting that is kind of the certificate. It's kind of like a greetings card, I guess. And that has been rendered a bit useless, because if actually all decisions about how you exist in the world and should be treated by the law and the criminal justice system and everything else is meant to be based on your birth sex, then it's kind of on this, why do we have this? But then, one of the things that the Supreme Court is meant to do is to kind of try and interpret what the original intention of the law was. And it may be the case that even if you could suggest that the Equalities Act was maybe not designed with trans people in mind, you do then have this thing where you go, well, if lawmakers further down the line have introduced gender recognition certificates, then okay, well, how does that play into things? You've essentially decided that those things, clearly lawmakers passing subsequent laws, making subsequent decisions, kind of have been interpreting it in that way. I mean, there are also cases wherein it is going to be, at best, exceptionally difficult to work out what someone's birth sex is, right? If you are someone who has transitioned medically, sort of physically, how do you prove that this person is not, unless you are in the context of a hospital where that possibly would be a legitimate reason to go and look at someone's medical records for the purpose of determining that, but in most other scenarios, that is not something that is a possibility. Practically, this whole thing is going to be a shit show. Anyway, I mean, the additional aspect of it being that if you are a cis woman, a cis man, and a police officer or whoever else is saying, I actually think you're trans and you're going to be searched by, you present as a man, say, but I've decided that actually you're a trans man and that you're you were born a woman, you're going to be searched by this woman. Proving that is not the case is going to be really tough. So there's kind of all of this going on. But the thing that has really stuck with me has been this image. I mean, and even these kind of celebrations, right? I was saying a moment ago that there's been kind of two responses, one of which has been protest. And in many ways, these are those kind of protests which really fit within that. I think I've talked in the past on stream about how sometimes when you go to a protest, alongside the advocating for a particular action, there is this kind of real sense of solidarity, just being with other people. I was saying a moment ago there's been kind of two responses to this, one of which being protest. I talked on stream before about the fact that, when you go to protest, there is the direct thing that you're intending to do, where you are trying to advocate for a policy or law or action, whatever it is, to be changed. And yet there's always also that kind of side thing of that kind of sense of being with other people who agree about this thing, like sort of seeing that actually there are a lot of people who agree with you on a topic, which, however much we talk about echo chambers and bubbles or whatever, in actual fact, to particularly to be progressive in the UK at the moment, can often feel isolating, and it can feel like you're disconnected. It can feel like you're alone, right, in many ways. And often that experience of like going to a large protest is that feeling of like, oh no, actually that is not the case. And I would imagine that is much the same, right? That because of the complicated nature of this particular ruling and the way in which the legal system works, etc., actually one of the really big things that is powerful about being at an event like this is that thing of going like, do you know what? Like, I'm not, like, it makes you kind of feel good about human beings, right? I remember when I went last year, went to one of the kind of really big protests, anti-genocide protests in London. And, you know, if I go to a static demonstration here in Plymouth, it's, you know, like sometimes if it's like certain causes, you can get a decent enough turnout, but you know, you've probably got a couple of hundred people at most. I went up to London to one of the big marches, and you know, there is always just that sense of like, oh wow, like I don't know, people are good. Actually, it turns out there are a lot of good people, and that doesn't erase the badnesses, but it gives you a sense of sanity, maybe. But the other reaction, as articulated here in this image, has been one of celebration and jubilation on the part of transphobes who have been pushing for laws like this. In particular, legal rulings or new laws which say sex is defined at birth and can never be changed. And the one in particular that stuck with me has been this one, in which J.K. Rowling really does kind of show herself up to be Andrew Tate for middle-class white ladies. And it was just such a, like, fascinating, horrible insight into kind of the mind of the British transphobe, right? Where, in theory, right, if you were to kind of take the reason for pushing for these kind of rulings at face value, you know, surely what you should be doing here is celebrating a win for equality, right? Celebrating like a kind of positive political shift as you see it. And yet, what we actually see is that almost all of it is about gloating about having been sort of part of this movement that has pushed for this certain thing, and kind of showing this real kind of, what does it mean to be like a bad winner, right? Like, what does it mean to there's this real kind of energy of less of, you know, we have put energy into a political campaign and established rights or protected women from XYZ. What we actually have is a, like, we've owned the libs energy. It's really interesting to watch in joining some of the dots between British transphobia, as exemplified here specifically by J.K. Rowling, but as has been exemplified by many of the transphobic activists who have really pushed for rulings like this, and the far right in America. Not only because these two groups both end up pushing for things which end up backfiring to hurt them, the many ways in which this ruling could be very easily used to make the lives of women, of cis women, even like worse, there is a clear mirror in, I don't know, the ways in which you've seen over the last few months American voters who have voted for Donald Trump, who have then seen their pensions, their life savings, their stock market gains or whatever from however, even their jobs slashed because of the actions of the guy they voted for. There's those elements of like the thing backfires, and yet that doesn't really matter because the end goal which they would kind of suggest they had if they were trying to present themselves as having like a legit argument within a kind of polite political conversation have long ago faded, and it has become entirely about owning the libs, right? Or destroying my enemies or whatever, which for some it kind of always has been. But I would imagine that there are some people who kind of jumped into the fray of kind of turfism with a kind of like genuine belief about that there was this kind of threat to women, that they had been convinced of that by newspapers, by X, by it's been very much been a top down push here in the UK. It has been pushed by women like J.K. Rowling with huge amounts of cultural power. I was going back to an article by Julie Bindel from when Donald Trump was elected, where she wrote, and I can't remember whether it was this piece or whether it was another piece that I read by her following Donald Trump's election, where she was like, yeah, probably some bad stuff's going to happen for women, but at least the gender ideology is going to be gone or whatever. And you're like, yeah, but it's like, this is a guy that has enabled the rolling back of abortion rights, right? This is like, there's no good going to come out of this. And like the fact that you've happened to get one over on your enemies, your life is still going to be worse because of that. I mean, obviously not Julie Bindel. I don't think she lives in America. But the lives of, the women that Julie Bindel supposes that she's writing about in this article are going to get worse. But that doesn't matter, right? Because you get to post pictures like this. You get to celebrate. You've kind of like won. And I think there's a bunch of different aspects to this in terms of like, how does right-wing politics really work? And some of it is a scarcity politics. I think the way in which it initially draws people in is very much a politics of scarcity. And this is kind of an idea that has been around for, a very long time. But I kind of sort of got reframed for me, I guess, would be the way to describe it. Some of you will have seen that Ezra Klein has recently, and Derek Thomason, recently published a book called Abundance. And I will say that the direction it ends up going in is disappointing. I've not read the entirety of the book. I've begun it, but I have seen a video in which he kind of summarizes the core thrust of the argument. The place it ends up going is kind of really disappointing and lame. It's kind of about how planning permission and like zoning laws are holding back growth, and that's kind of, liberals can't get people to vote for them because zoning laws aren't good enough and you have to do too many environmental checks to build a railway. And there's kind of like interesting stuff in there, but it's all like very much small fry. But the opening of the argument is this argument that Trumpism relies on a politics of scarcity, and that you can kind of apply that across various different places, right? And I think this comes into the UK as well. You can say that there is a scarcity of housing, and therefore we should crack down on migration, right? Because the migrants are coming for your house, and there's not enough houses. And we don't need to have a conversation about why there isn't enough houses, but there just aren't enough houses. There can never be enough houses, and they're coming for that, right? And you can say that about school places. You can say that about government spending, right? Government spending. The government doesn't have enough money. We're in too much debt. If the government is paying for a poorer family somewhere to help put food on their table, then that's your taxes, and that's money that you could have, right? This real kind of scarcity, crabs in a bucket, I guess, kind of world. And one of the ways in which contemporary transphobia kind of gets people in the UK at least, gets people in the front door, is through a scarcity mindset surrounding rights. Yeah, so it can't be that women have hard-won, hard-fought for civil rights and protections, and we should or could look at how other groups could also have rights and protections applied to them, or kind of laid down in law. No, if someone else gets rights, you have lost rights. Yeah, because there's a scarce amount of rights hanging around. All of this is kind of a little bit downstream from the kind of economization of everything. There's a great bit in Kate Raworth's Don't Economic, but where she kind of talks about the ways in which a kind of neoliberal kind of or neoclassical economic model of kind of supply, demand, and scarcity and choices, which has kind of come to dominate economic conversations, has also come to dominate in lots of other arenas as well. I mean, you think of something like Freakonomics, which was really popular back in, like the 2000s? 2005 it came out, apparently, which was this idea, which was really popular in the academy already, was that, economics isn't just about money and about how we use resources in that sense. Actually, anything can be economics when you really think about it, because sort of everything is scarce and needs to be distributed, which kind of there's some truth to using that in some way, but what happens is that you apply a scarcity to things. I mean, if you look at a lot of kind of manosphere content or kind of podcast bro content, one of the real bedrocks of it is discussions about relationships which view dating as an economy, in which there are a scarce number of women, and it is always from this angle. This isn't me saying this. There's a scarce number of women to go around, and all of the high value men are going to get all the high value women, but also the high value men are going to get the low value women as well. And me, as only a medium value man, how am I going to fit into this economy? Which just isn't how dating really works. Once you actually dig into it, people value stuff in potential partners so differently. It's really interesting that I'm trying to find, so there's been, here's the particular article. So just over a year ago, John Byrne Murdoch published this piece in the Financial Times about the divergence between men and women in terms of politics, which is largely that. And kind of when we talk about the idea that men are shifting to the right, actually women have kind of gone to the left or more liberal, kind of more than men have shifted to the right. And you often will see this in kind of manosphere spaces. These charts posted alongside data which suggests that like listening to Joe Rogan is a red flag. So so there was a slightly different piece of polling, and to what extent we should place too much emphasis on like single polls is kind of, questionable. But there was a poll which suggested that for younger women, identifying as a MAGA Republican was a red flag for 76%. Saying all lives matter was 60%. Only two genders, 58%. Listening to Joe Rogan, 55%. Refusing to see the Barbie movie with 53%. Which, they kind of use as a, the women are wrong kind of thing. But what actually this shows is that regardless of that kind of scarcity model of the manosphere where there's high-value women and low-value women and high-value men and low-value men, and that's largely to do with looks. You look at a chart like this and you go, well, actually, clearly for a lot of women, looks is not sort of the be-all and end-all, right? There are clearly other things which matter. And that is, it's not just those two things that matter, right? Generally, dating and relationships are really complicated mixes of things that people value in a different person. And to kind of present it as this sort of scarcity model, it just doesn't quite crack it at all. And so I think what often gets people in the front door of a lot of this transphobic backlash is that kind of scarcity model of politics, where if someone is gaining rights, someone else is clearly losing rights. However, I think what eventually ends up keeping people around and what ends up pushing people to the very extremes of it is a kind of contrarianism. I mean, it is kind of that Galileo complex, right? Of thinking that, of wanting to present oneself as a renegade and as, you think that trans people should have rights? You think we should be nice to people? Well, actually, I think we shouldn't. And which kind of runs through so much of these like celebrations. I mean the overlap between J.K. Rowling and Elon Musk, as people who kind of thought they should be celebrated by certain communities and therefore had to kick against them when people were like, oh yeah, you're probably fine, is fascinating, right? Whether it was Elon Musk thinking that environmentalists were going to love him because he'd done an electric car, and environmentalists were like, oh yeah, that's kind of a step forward, but probably we need bigger changes to really ameliorate the effects of climate crisis. And I genuinely think that's a large part of his spin to the right. I think there's so much of that baked into J.K. Rowling's, if I say Dumbledore kind of was gay theoretically, I didn't write it down, but that's in there, I promise, and thought she would be kind of embraced and held up, and then everyone was like, oh, that's weird, but okay. None of which is to say that the kind of impact of the activism, that the velocity of the hate, that all of that stuff does not have real world impacts. I think, but it is kind of the thing that hangs so much of this together. And the kind of final spin to all of this is that we've seen already the ways in which right-wing activists and right-wing interest groups want to push this in the future. There's a bit in... John Oliver did a piece about trans athletes a few weeks back, and he kind of talks about how in the US, you know, they tried the kind of bathroom bills, and that worked for a bit, but didn't quite work. And then talking about trans athletes seemed to get some traction. In the UK, that's been a little bit different. Like it seems to have been kind of women's refuges seems to have been one of the things that has kind of gained some traction. Kind of talking about that in relation to whether trans women should be able to access those spaces. But the question about what happens next, because those kind of interest groups will be looking at kind of, well, what is the next target? And an activist called Elizabeth Heverin was this today? No, a few days back, was tweeting kind of that, you know, we may have won the Supreme Court ruling on the legal definition of a woman, but a bigger battle is to be had. Mass migration is threatening the safety of our women. I'm proud to launch Women's Safety UK and serve as the head of development. It's time to put our women first. Again, that kind of scarcity thing. Our women, we only have so many women. Using it as the basis of using kind of these same fears around women's safety as the basis for a campaign against migration, right? Immigration. And, you know, alongside this, we've seen attempts to bring anti-abortion activism into the UK. Abortion rights in the UK are extremely popular. Like, all of the polling shows that the vast majority, like in the 80-something% of people support the right to an abortion. And there are kind of complexities about the fact that abortion in the UK actually isn't legal. It's just if you get signatures from two doctors, it becomes it's still, abortion is still criminalized. If you buy abortion tablets off the internet and take them, then you can be prosecuted for that, and that does happen. Like, technically abortion is illegal. It's just that there are paths you can follow to sort of get around that. But abortion rights are super popular, particularly amongst women, right? And yet there are kind of attempts to push this in that direction as well. My one takeaway from this, though, would be based upon this. As I said earlier, I think there is going to be an attempt on the part of politicians to use this ruling as a way of getting them away from having to do any politics, not just now, but going into the future. And as a way of them going, no, look, the Supreme Court has said X, Y, Z. But the Supreme Court can only interpret laws that have been passed by Parliament. And Parliament has it in its power to say, we think that that law has therefore been written incorrectly, right? And so my takeaway from all of this would be to not let them do that. To, you know, make them either go, well, if you're going to back transphobic laws, then, you know, let's make it clear that you are choosing to do that. You are choosing not to pass legislation to change what the law is, if this ruling is the correct interpretation of that law, and if you don't want people to kind of view it in that way, then you need to pass laws to change it.